They said Adrian drowned. That was the official version. The one in the Coast Guard's incident report. The one I recited to the funeral director on Abercorn Street. To the senior partners at the U.S. Attorney's Office who kept sending condolence emails I couldn't bring myself to open. My husband had gone out alone on a Sunday morning. The way he did every few weeks when the weight of running his firm got heavy enough that he needed open water and sky to clear his head. His kayak was found capsized near the marshes south of Skidaway Island. His body 2 days later. 5 days after we buried him, his former business partner called me at 2 a.m. A man who by every record that existed had been dead for 6 years. My name is Darcy Kellner. I'm 38 years old, a federal prosecutor for the Southern District of Georgia, and for 11 years I was Adrian's wife. I have stood in federal courtrooms and cross-examined people who lied to my face with the practiced ease of lifelong habit. I know what concealment looks like from the outside. I know the specific texture of a story that has been shaped by someone who needs it to be believed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the days after the Coast Guard handed me Adrian's wedding ring in a small plastic bag, I already knew that what they'd handed me wasn't the whole truth. Adrian Kellner was 44 years old. He had the kind of face that looked best in natural light, laugh lines he'd earned honestly, gray beginning at his temples that he refused to dye, because he said vanity was a luxury for people with more time than sense. He'd built his architectural firm, Kellner Design Group, from a 2-person operation in a converted garage near Forsyth Park into one of the most respected firms in the Southeast. He was methodical and precise and funnier than anyone who met him in a professional context ever expected. He used to leave notes on the bathroom mirror in dry erase marker, little diagrams of the house projects he was mulling over, with arrows and annotations that only made sense to him. After he died, I left the last one up for 3 weeks before I finally made myself erase it. We didn't have a dramatic love story. What we had was better than that. 11 years of being the person the other one called first. 11 years of his hand finding mine in the dark of a movie theater, or across a restaurant table when the food was taking too long, like some reflex he'd never bothered to train away. I was gone on cases sometimes, weeks-long federal trials that swallowed my life whole, and he held everything steady at home without once making me feel the weight of his patience. He used to say that I prosecuted criminals, and he built buildings, and between the two of us, we were doing exactly what Savannah needed most. Then came the Coast Guard, and then the funeral, and then the particular silence of a house that still smells like someone who isn't coming back. My brother-in-law Corbin was the one who handled most of the immediate arrangements. He is Adrian's younger brother. 41, handsome in the polished way of someone who's always been aware of it, a commercial real estate broker who had spent years orbiting the edges of Adrian's professional success without ever quite achieving his own. His wife Sylvie was at the funeral in a black dress that was somehow too fitted for the occasion, standing just slightly apart from the family cluster in a way I noticed and told myself I was being uncharitable to notice. Grief makes you suspicious of things that don't deserve suspicion. That's what I told myself. I was wrong to tell myself that. The call came at 2:07 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water I hadn't touched, going through the stack of condolence cards that had been accumulating on the counter. The number on my phone screen was unfamiliar, a 912 area code, local but not one I recognized. Darcy. The voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of voice that doesn't raise itself because it's never needed to. This is Harrison Thorne. I knew the name. Harrison Thorne had been the primary client relationship behind Kellner Design Group's biggest contracts. A developer who'd made his fortune in mixed-use projects along the Georgia coast and had trusted Adrian's firm with the kind of work that put them in architectural publications. I'd met him perhaps a dozen times at firm events. A reserved man in his 60s, impeccably dressed, who had always struck me as someone who said exactly what he meant and nothing more. "Mr. Thorne," I said, "it's the middle of the night." "I know what time it is." A pause. "I need you to come to my office. Tonight, if you can. I have something that belonged to Adrian." Another pause, shorter. "Darcy, don't sign anything your brother-in-law puts in front of you, and don't tell Corbin where you're going." The line went quiet after that. Just my own breathing and the sound of a ceiling fan turning somewhere in the house. I put on shoes and drove through empty Savannah streets with my hands very steady on the wheel, which is the thing my body does when my brain is processing something it hasn't finished understanding yet. I've cross-examined murderers with that same steadiness. It isn't calm. It's the concentration that replaces calm when calm isn't available. Harrison Thorne's offices occupied the top 2 floors of a renovated cotton warehouse on River Street, dark at that hour except for a light in the upper windows. His assistant, young, male, alert in the way of someone who had been specifically told to expect me, met me at the door and took me up without a word. The office was all exposed brick and wide plank floors, the kind of thoughtful renovation Adrian always appreciated, and Harrison was standing near the window with his back to the door when I came in. But he wasn't alone. There was a second man in the room. He was seated near Harrison's desk, somewhere in his mid-40s, lean, with a close-cropped beard that was nearly all gray. He stood when I entered, and when the light from the window fell across his face, every coherent thought I had assembled during the drive over scattered completely. I knew that face. I had seen it at firm holiday parties years ago. I had seen it in the framed photograph on Adrian's bookshelf, the one from the early days of the firm when it was still 2 people and a lease they could barely afford. I had also seen that face in a funeral program 6 years ago. The service had been small, there had been a widow. Adrian had come home from it and been quiet for 3 days. Declan, I said, and the word came out barely a word at all. Declan Farrow, Adrian's original business partner, the man who had supposedly died in a fire at a storage facility in West Savannah 6 years ago, leaving behind a wife, 2 school-age daughters, and a modest estate that had been quietly settled and closed. "Sit down," Harrison said from behind me, and I did, because my legs had decided that was the appropriate response to the architecture of the impossible. Declan sat back down across from me. He looked like someone who had spent 6 years being very careful about everything. Careful how he sat, careful how he held his face, careful with the particular economy of a man who had learned that being noticed was a form of risk. "I didn't die in that fire," he said. "Harrison helped me disappear. I'd found something inside Kellner Design Group, financial irregularities tied to a shell company that was being used to siphon revenue from firm contracts. The kind of thing that, if it surfaced, would have destroyed the firm and put people in federal prison." He paused. The people behind it were not people who accepted accountability gracefully. Harrison and I decided the safest thing I could do was stop being Declan Farrow. I looked at Harrison. "I should have found another way," Harrison said, and he sounded like a man who had rehearsed that sentence many times and still found it insufficient. At the time it seemed like the only option. I was wrong about several things. "Why now?" I asked. The same question anyone asks when the past walks back through the door. "Why are you showing yourself now?" Declan's jaw tightened. "Because 4 months ago Adrian found me. He tracked me through a contact I thought was completely buried, and he drove to where I was living. I won't say where, and he sat across a table from me and told me he'd been looking into something. Not the old firm matter. Something closer to home." He reached into his jacket and set a small leather portfolio on the desk between us. "He asked me to keep this for him. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to make sure it reached you. Only you." I looked at the portfolio. I didn't reach for it immediately. "He said something else," Declan added, quieter now. He said, "If it comes to that, look at what Corbin has been doing with the estate paperwork. Look at it carefully." My brother-in-law's face rose in my mind. The way he'd appeared at my door the morning after Adrian's body was recovered, before I'd even called anyone. The documents he'd already had prepared. Condolence and practicality, he'd said, just getting ahead of the administrative burden so I wouldn't have to. I'd been too hollowed out with grief to ask why he'd had them prepared at all. Inside the portfolio, when Harrison turned the small brass clasp, was a USB drive, a bound notebook dense with Adrian's handwriting, and a sealed envelope with my name on it in his block-letter architectural print. There was also a photograph, Corbin in a downtown parking garage shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit, and the timestamp in the lower corner was from 8 weeks before Adrian's death. Adrian had been looking into his own brother. Quietly, methodically, the way he approached every project that mattered, by gathering every fact before he opened his mouth. He found inconsistencies in the firm's equity documentation, Harrison said. Corbin had been named as a secondary stakeholder in an amended partnership agreement that Adrian did not sign. The signature on the document, Adrian's signature, did not match his authentic hand. Adrian brought it to me 6 weeks before he died. He was trying to determine whether it was forgery or a filing error before he confronted anyone. The word forgery landed in my chest with the particular weight of a thing I had heard in courtrooms, but had never expected to hear about my own family. "He never told me," I said. Harrison was quiet for a moment. He didn't want you carrying it while a trial consumed you. He said you had enough. I sat with that, with the image of Adrian at his desk late at night while I was buried in case files across town, building his own case in silence, protecting me from something he wasn't yet certain of. Declan connected the USB drive to a laptop on Harrison's desk. What came up was a folder of documents, equity filings, wire transfer records, correspondence between Corbin and a law firm I recognized as one that specialized in estate restructuring. And then, at the bottom of the folder, a video file dated 7 weeks before the kayaking accident. Harrison pressed play. Adrian's face filled the screen. He was in his home office. I recognized the shelves behind him, the drafting lamp. He looked tired in the way he looked when a project had been demanding more than he'd let on. But his eyes were steady, looking directly into the camera the way he always looked at me across our kitchen table when something serious needed to be said. "If you're watching this," he said, and the sound of his voice in that room, at that hour, broke something open in me that I had been holding together with pure professional discipline since the Coast Guard called. "Then things didn't go the way I hoped." He paused. "I need you to know I'm sorry I didn't tell you while I still could. I kept thinking I'd have more time. I kept thinking I'd find enough to make it airtight before I said a word. A small, tired exhale. You'd have told me I was doing it wrong, you'd have been right." He spent the next several minutes walking through what he'd found. The falsified equity amendment, the wire transfers to a holding company in Delaware, registered to a shell entity that traced back, through 2 layers of paperwork, to Corbin's wife Sylvie. The plan, as best as Adrian had reconstructed it, was to establish Corbin as a legitimate co-owner of the firm prior to Adrian's death, giving him grounds to claim half its assets through the estate, assets that, without the forged document, would have passed entirely to me. "He needed me gone," Adrian said on the video, in the same quiet voice he used for everything that mattered, "before I found enough to confront him legally. I don't know what that means, Darcy. I want to be wrong about what it means." His voice didn't shake. That was the thing that undid me, that his voice didn't shake, that he'd been carrying this alone for months and had never once let me hear it. "The box has everything I found. Harrison has the box, be careful, please." The screen went dark. Harrison's phone rang a moment later. He answered, listened, and when he looked at me, his expression had shifted into something careful and grim. "My security team," he said. "Someone just entered your house through the back. They're gone now. They were gone before anyone could respond. But Darcy, they were in Adrian's home office." I knew exactly what they had been looking for. Adrian kept a fireproof filing cabinet in his home office, a heavy steel one bolted to the floor in the closet. I'd known about it for years. The spare key lived on a hook behind the door frame, a fact Adrian had mentioned once and probably assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't forgotten. I'd simply understood that every person who builds things for a living needs somewhere they can put the things they haven't built yet. We drove to the house in Harrison's car, his security detail following in a second vehicle. 2 Chatham County Sheriff's deputies were already on the scene when we arrived, and one of them met me at the door with the careful expression of someone delivering a diagnosis. The back door lock had been forced. No other rooms were disturbed. The home office door was standing open. The filing cabinet was still there, but its lock had been drilled clean through. The drawer was empty. Whoever had done this had known exactly where to look and exactly what to take. Except. I stood in the doorway of that office for a long moment, looking at the empty cabinet. Declan was behind me. And after a moment he said quietly, "Look at the dust line inside the drawer." I looked. The thin film of dust that accumulates on interior surfaces, undisturbed for months, was even across the entire base of the drawer. Nothing had been sitting in there recently. Whatever had been inside that cabinet had been removed a long time ago. "He moved everything," Declan said, "months before he died. Whatever they took tonight was either a decoy or nothing." Harrison crouched beside the cabinet, examined the inside edge with a small flashlight, and stood. "He built the real case somewhere else," he said, knowing someone might come looking eventually. 3 days later I received a call from a forensic document examiner named Agnes Town, a retired FBI specialist Adrian had contacted 3 months before his death. She'd been waiting, she told me carefully, to hear from someone. Adrian had told her she would. She met me at her office in Midtown with a legal pad full of findings and a voice like a woman who has spent 30 years being unsurprised by what people will forge. The partnership amendment was unambiguously not signed by Adrian. The ink distribution, pressure patterns, and letter formation were inconsistent with his authenticated signature across 14 other documents she'd compared against. Someone had been good at this, she said. Professional grid forgery, but not good enough that it would survive scrutiny in federal court. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with Agnes's preliminary report and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, I made a decision. I let myself feel the grief for exactly as long as it took to finish the coffee. And then I folded it away, the way you fold away everything that has to wait until the work is finished, and I started thinking like a prosecutor. I called Corbin the next morning, told him I was still struggling with everything, which was true enough, and that I was thinking about what to do with the firm, with the house, with the estate. He offered to help. He said that's what family was for. He had a document ready, he mentioned offhandedly, something his attorney had drafted just to clarify the firm's governance structure going forward. Nothing urgent, but whenever I was ready. I said I was ready soon. Sylvie came by the following week with the paperwork in a manila folder and a plate of lemon bars that she set on my kitchen counter, with the careful cheer of a woman who believed she was one signature away from something she'd been planning for a long time. I read through the document with the expression of a confused, grieving widow. I asked the kinds of questions a person asks who doesn't do this for a living. I told her I needed a few more days to think it over. I signed nothing. Agnes had been very clear about that. Declan, meanwhile, had agreed to come out of the legal shadow he'd been living in for 6 years. A process that involved attorneys and a federal disclosure agreement that Harrison's legal team had quietly initiated. He installed a small recording device in my sitting room, the room with the east-facing windows where Corbin and Sylvie always chose to sit, where the light was best and the acoustics carried clearly. Over 3 weeks, they gave me everything I needed. Corbin let it slip once, in a conversation about the timeline of the firm restructuring, that he'd been planning this since before Adrian died, that he'd expected things to be resolved by February, which was 2 months before the kayaking accident. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my face carefully neutral, and I let him finish the sentence. The partners' meeting at Kellner Design Group was scheduled on a Thursday morning, ostensibly to address firm governance following the death of its founder. Corbin arrived 12 minutes early in a suit that was slightly too new. Sylvie sat beside him with a leather portfolio she'd brought, as though she were already running something. I arrived with Harrison on one side of me and Agnes on the other. Corbin's expression when he saw Harrison didn't change immediately. It was the kind of face a person makes when they're recalculating quickly, looking for the explanation that fits. And then the side door opened and Declan Farrow walked into the conference room, and whatever calculation Corbin had been running fell completely apart. "That's not possible," Sylvie said. It was barely a whisper. "It's very possible," Declan said, setting his portfolio on the conference table. "I've spent 6 years making it look otherwise. I'm here because Adrian Kellner asked me to be, and because I was tired of staying dead." Agnes walked the room through the forensic findings, the forged signature, the Delaware Shell Company, the wire transfer records. Corbin interrupted twice with legal objections that weren't legal objections, the reflexive protests of someone who has always been able to talk his way out of consequences and is discovering for the first time that the room isn't arranged in his favor. Declan connected his laptop to the conference room display. "There's one more thing," he said. Adrian was thorough. The audio recording was from a conversation Corbin had in my sitting room 6 days earlier. His own voice came through the speakers, unhurried and confident, explaining to Sylvie that once the equity amendment was filed with the estate, Darcy would be too grief-fogged to read the fine print, and that by the time she understood what had happened, the restructuring would be legally complete. The room went very quiet. Sylvie turned to look at Corbin. What crossed her face wasn't exactly surprise, it was the expression of a person who has allowed herself to not know something for a long time, and has just run out of room to keep not knowing it. "That's taken out of context," Corbin said, but his voice had lost its shape. Harrison closed his laptop. "The firm's legal counsel has reviewed all documentation over the past several weeks with outside forensic accounting. Effective today, Kellner Design Group remains in sole trust under Darcy Kellner's name, as specified in Adrian's authenticated estate filings and his firm's original partnership agreement, the only one bearing signatures that are genuine." Harrison looked at Corbin directly, and there was nothing unkind in it. Just the flat factual weight of a man who has made up his mind. "This meeting is over." The door opened. 2 Chatham County detectives had been waiting in the hall. I stood and looked at my brother-in-law across the conference table. This man who had stood at Adrian's grave and wept in a way I'd believed was real, who had been at my door before I'd even made my calls, who had slid documents across my kitchen table and called it family. He documented everything, I said. That was who Adrian was. He never accused anyone of anything until he was certain. He was certain. Corbin didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that would have mattered. The federal investigation took 4 months. The Delaware Shell Company unraveled into a larger pattern of financial fraud, including insurance fraud tied to a policy Corbin had quietly taken out on his brother's life, a policy with a beneficiary designation that named Sylvie, filed 11 months before Adrian died. Whether that policy was the motive or just opportunism, dressed up as planning, was a question the prosecutors worked through carefully. They were thorough. I knew some of them. I sat on the other side of that process for the first time in my career and trusted them to do what I knew how to do, because I couldn't do it myself. That was harder than I expected. Corbin was indicted on charges of fraud, forgery, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. Sylvie cooperated early and received a reduced charge. Whether Adrian's death was accident or something more deliberate remained, in the end, what the evidence could support but couldn't prove beyond the standard the law requires. I held that with both hands for a long time. I'm still holding it. What I can tell you is that the forensic analysis of the kayak found no anomalies that couldn't be explained by the conditions that morning. What I can tell you is that a federal prosecutor learns to work within what the evidence will bear, and to grieve separately what justice cannot reach. Those are 2 different processes and they don't resolve each other. You simply carry them both. I kept the firm. I kept the house with the bathroom mirror where Adrian used to leave his dry erase diagrams. I found, in the weeks after the trial concluded, a storage unit key tucked inside the back cover of his bound notebook, the small brass key I hadn't understood when I first saw it. The unit was registered under a name I didn't recognize, paid up for 2 years. Inside, the original filing cabinet contents, every document, every photograph, a sealed envelope on top with my name on it in his handwriting, dated the week before he died. His letter ran 4 pages. He wrote about the firm, about what he hoped I'd do with it. He wrote about a charitable trust he'd been quietly funding. A small thing, just getting started, aimed at pro bono legal support for working families in housing disputes, the kind of cases that slipped through every gap because no one could afford to bring them. He'd named it after both of us. He asked if I'd consider running it. Near the end, he'd written, "I know how you work. I know you'll prosecute this thing until it's done and grieve it afterward. I know you'll be fine eventually because you've always been the most stubborn person I've ever loved, and I've always been grateful for it. I just wish I'd had more time to tell you that in person." I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. The house was quiet the way it's been quiet since March, but the quality of the silence had changed somehow, the way a room changes when you finally open the windows. I walked out onto the back porch where we used to sit summer evenings with cheap wine and no particular agenda, and I looked at the Savannah sky going dark over the live oaks, and for the first time since the Coast Guard's call, I let myself feel something that wasn't grief or anger, or the cold purpose that had been keeping me standing. Adrian had known exactly what he was doing. He had built the case the same way he built everything, carefully, with attention to every load-bearing detail, thinking always about what would last. He had been protecting me from a distance, the same way he always had, with the particular quiet devotion of a man who showed love through preparation rather than declaration. I kept the trust. I kept the firm. I started running both of them the way he would have wanted, with the same methodical attention he'd brought to everything he believed was worth building. And sometimes, when a case is particularly hard or a decision is close, I go to his home office and sit at his drafting desk and think about what he would have said, in that calm, certain way of his. He was usually right. He was usually, in the end, the most honest person in any room he walked into. That's what I carry forward. That, and the certainty that the best thing I can still do for him is to make sure what he built doesn't go to waste.